Hi, welcome to session 2 of the fourth topic of the semester, the Texas Revolution of 1836. Now, we're going to continue in this session discussing the first segment of this topic that is going to look at the Texas Revolution in the larger context that we have been looking at, of course, and that is the age of revolutions. That is to say, the purpose again of this first segment is to situate the Texas Revolution as part of a larger historical process that had begun back in the 1600s in Europe with the first democratic revolution in England, that is to say, the English Civil War. So what we were actually discussing in the first session again is that there will be a series of revolutions that are going to sweep across the Western world, particularly Western Europe. And of course, we're going to look also at how those revolutions will come to the Americas, beginning in North America with the American Revolution, of course, and spreading elsewhere. But what is very significant, again, is that the Texas Revolution was part of this process of revolutionary upheavals that had begun as early as the 1600s with the rise of capitalism and the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Revolution. So that's exactly how this process initiated back in the 1600s, again, with the rise of capitalism, the merchant class. We were talking about how we're going to see the rise of a new social group. This group is going to be fundamental in creating most of the political changes that will come about from those revolutions that we have been discussing so far and that we will discuss in this session as well. So again, the rise of the merchant class, along with the ideas of private property, are going to be central, again, to the coming revolutions of the 16, 17, and 1800s. Again, so this is part of a revolutionary movement, if you will, that initiate with the rise of capitalism, the merchant class, property, of course, private property, and with that, of course, the merchants demand more and more political representation in the state because they're the ones actually bearing most of the burden of taxes. They are the ones that will have to actually pay the tribute or the taxes to the monarchs. And the monarchs, of course, see that this is a very important group that can actually contribute the most to the state. In other words, if the king needed money, the only thing they need to do is just, again, tax the merchants. But because there was no system of representation, the merchants had no say in how much taxes they needed to pay or negotiate, agreements with the monarch, in terms of, well, I'll give you the taxes, but again, the king must grant certain concessions to the merchants. Of course, that led to the tensions that will lead eventually to ruptures in the political order. And of course, the merchants are going to create alliances with other groups, whether they were farmers or other peoples. And of course, by building those alliances, we're going to see the coming of those revolutions, of course. The Protestant Reformation was also instrumental in bringing about those changes because the involvement, of course, of the church in the state had been going on for many, many centuries. The church had been collecting tribute from people and, of course, exerting a religious monopoly on the populations of Europe. But with the Protestant Reformation, what we're going to see is there will be, of course, groups of people that left the church and they're going to actually try to reform Christianity according to how they interpreted the teachings of the Bible and so on, and create their own independent churches that will be run democratically. So this idea of democracy, again, in terms of people pretty much being in charge of their own affairs, of how they're going to organize their churches and who they're going to elect are their ministers and so on. It's also part of those age of revolutions that we have been discussing in the first session again, that the Protestants in this case are going to, in many cases, make alliances with the merchants as I mentioned, they're going to come together to try to bring about change, political change, a new type of system that will provide representation to people. In other words, that whenever laws have to be made, that people have to be taken into account, that is to say, and of course, to try to separate the church from the state, to allow people to pretty much, again, practice their religion freely. So they can actually be in charge of their own churches in a more democratic way, that is to say. So again, we looked at the English Civil War. Of course, that's pretty much the first revolutionary upheaval of the age of revolutions that was produced by both capitalism and the Protestant Reformation. And so that, of course, was a large process, very long process, again, of revolutionary change that swept across England, that ended up, of course, with the triumph of the merchants, in this case by pretty much establishing a new form of government known as a parliamentary system of government. The Parliament is now going to rule England. By 1689, there's going to be, of course, now this new state in England, in which the merchants, in this case, control the state through the Parliament, and Parliament is now going to write the laws, the legislation for England, and the merchants are represented, again, in this new Parliament as well. There's the introduction of Bill of Rights and so on and so forth. So we were looking at that as well. And also, again, the ideas of the Enlightenment of John Locke and Rousseau are also going to be influential in the revolutions that we're going to examine here in this session, in which John Locke and Rousseau are pretty much in the 1700s and the age of Enlightenment, the Enlightenment revolution, this philosophical revolution. They're going to present the ideas, again, of natural rights philosophy, that, people are born with certain rights by nature, life, liberty, and property, and those are sacred. And again, this is what, the ideal state is going to entail in the formation of new states, again, and that those states will have to oversee, if you will, those rights of life, liberty, and property. Of course, we also see Rousseau talking about the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed entail, of course, providing representation to people, particularly people that own property, and as well a system of elections as well. Okay, allowing people to have a say, a vote, again, in terms of who's going to be in charge. The rulers, the leaders, the representatives, and so on, they're going to be elected by the people through a process of election. So again, those are new ideas, again, in the 1700s, that are proposing a new ideal state. What kind of state should be the ideal one to rule over human societies? And again, this takes us now to our outlines here. Okay, so we can actually proceed with this revolution, the American Revolution, that is going to be very influential in shaping the Texas Revolution, because, as we'll see, many of the ideas of the Texas Revolution were rooted in the American Revolution. And the American Revolution really was inspired by the previous revolutions that we just covered, like the English Civil War, for example, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So the American Revolution was simply a continuation, again, of this process of change. And we're going to see, of course, merchants demanding representation, the creation of a new state that will be ideal, that will provide, of course, a voice, to people, certain groups of people, and so on and so forth, a system of elections, etc. So we're not really going to cover the entire American Revolution. It's just those particular features or characteristics that are going to help us understand the Texas Revolution, just again for the purpose of understanding the Texas Revolution. So the American Revolution of 1776, again, the background rather quickly, go back to the formation of the colonies as companies. Okay, this is one of the, again, central arguments of the American Revolution, is that the 13 colonies, when they were actually created by Great Britain, back in the 1600s, the vast majority of them were. They were created to operate like companies. They were given a charter. Each one of those colonies were given a charter, that is to say, a legal permit. In other words, to exist and to operate in North America on behalf of England, okay, of the mother country, that is to say. Okay, so yes, there were colonies, but in a very legal way, the way they were legally created, their legal framework and the way they existed and operated again is that they functioned and operated and existed as companies for England, again, producing products again that will be exported to England. Those were, for the most part, actually companies that were owned by a series of merchants, okay, or investors, that is to say, that came together and formed those companies, that is to say, again. So those were back in Europe known as the joint stock companies. Joint stock is just a company. In modern day terminology, is just, you just call it again a company. And when you form a company, you come together with other investors, other people, you put capital together, and you form a company. It's owned by several shareholders, that is to say, or stockholders, that is to say, again. And those were trading companies, and they were given a legal permit to operate in North America in order to produce certain items, certain products that will be exported to the mother country, and the mother country was going to commercialize with them within England and in Europe and around the world. And they were given a charter, again, a legal permit to operate in North America, that is to say. So they were legal, in other words, entities. That's what a charter is. And also, they were given, of course, land grants, okay, by the king and the British Parliament. Both are going to actually give the stockholders, many of the people that are going to come and settle, many of them came with land grants, again, that were issued by the king or the Parliament in order to come to North America and actually develop land. For the purpose of developing enterprises like cattle ranches, farms, plantations, etc. There's various kinds of enterprises, that is to say. And also, they were given a certain degree of autonomy to actually rule themselves on, again, rule their own towns, rule their own cities, and so on. According to the values of the settlers, of the colonists, that is to say. So the colonists in many cases actually were in charge of running their own cities, their own towns, that is to say. And for the most part, again, the ones that were actually in charge of that were actually the property owners, whether they were merchants or they were plantation owners, etc. Those were the ones in charge, again, of the colonial assemblies. Those were actually the city councils, so to speak, that were actually running each one of those cities within those particular companies, that is to say. So there's a certain commercial, contract, if you will, that exists, that if you receive a legal charter and you're given a land grant, well, you're being given property, you have a property title, you have entitlements to operate, on behalf of the mother country, etc. Again, that is an economic, of course, entity. This is a commercial operation, that is to say. And of course, the people that actually, like I said, own those commercial enterprises, the merchants, the plantation owners are the ones actually in charge of those colonial assemblies. Now, of course, this is going to give rise, of course, to colonial merchants and wealthy planters in those 13 British colonies. We're going to see the rise of very prominent individuals who are going to be very successful in conducting trading operations, or they're going to be very successful in terms of creating one of the most successful plantations in the British colonies again. So this is a very prominent group of people. Again, that is going to arrive. They're born in America. They're not born in England, and they're born in America from their and they're going to be, of course, succeeding from their own economic enterprises. Okay, people in, again, very prominent merchants from Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and very wealthy planters are going to come from Virginia and South Carolina. Okay, so it is particularly those particular colonies, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, the upper colonies, we're going to see very wealthy merchants, again, arising there. And in the southern colonies of Virginia and South Carolina, we're going to see very wealthy planters as well, again, that are going to be very, influential in controlling the politics, of course, of Virginia and South Carolina as well. So for most of the colonial period, in the colonies were pretty much on their own. They had a kind of free trade system, even though they were not allowed to trade freely with whoever they wanted. They had an obligation to send all the products to the mother country, but that system of trade was not supervised. It was not monitored. It was, again, a free trade system that existed, in which those merchants I mentioned, those wealthy merchants and those wealthy planters, at times, what they were doing is they importing products from French, from Dutch companies, like teas, spices, rum, molasses, sugar. And what they will do is buy in bulk, wholesale, at cheap prices, and they will import those products into the colonies and sell them, of course, at a higher price. And that was pretty much, part of their success, of course. That, again, they were not really, again, constricted to do that. They, this type of trade was simply carried out on a day-to-day basis without any restrictions whatsoever. So there were no import or export duties, etc., or any limitations or, or legal, blocks that prevented them from trading again with the French and the Dutch, which, by the way, were the competitors of the British, by the way. So again, the colonies were actually trading with the competition, by the way. And also, it was also well known that wealthy planters in the South, like in the Carolinas and Virginia, were exporting sometimes products that they grew in their plantations, like tobacco and rice. There's also the exports of timber, furs, fish, and cattle that is being exported, again, not necessarily directly exported to the mother country, but once again, if you're a producer in the colonies and you have to be producing fish or cattle, there was a certain room to negotiate, again, who you wanted to trade with, just because, the colonies were pretty much left on their own to operate on their own for most of the colonial period. Again, of course, that situation was going to change. It will change, as we'll see. And of course, we're also going to see the rise of independent farmers as well in the colonies, that over time, and those people that were not necessarily merchants or they were not wealthy planters, the vast majority, again, of the colonies are going to simply engage in farming activities, the independent farmers owning their own land. This is what back in England was known as the yeoman farmer. The yeoman farmer was a farmer that was in control of the land, that owned the land, and that was his or her piece of property. But again, in the colonial period, again, it's pretty much males are the ones that are allowed to inherit and own property. We're not going to see the kind of changes, again, that are going to come about in the 1800s with, of course, allowing women, of course, the right to own property. But in the colonial period, it's a male-dominated society. Even private property was, of course, the exclusive rights of males at this time. And so this is a situation again that we're going to see, of course, the rise of a specific social group, and that are the farmers, and they're actually in control of their own lands. They own the lands and they pass it on to their descendants and so on and so forth. But with population growth, after 1650, from 1650 to 1750, that's a 100-year period, we're going to see, again, a dramatic increase in the colonies in terms of population, because of constant immigration from European immigrants are coming into the colonies from Scotland, from Ireland, from Germany, for example, in great numbers, and there's going to be the need for land. Of course, they're in pursuit of land. There is, of course, for those immigrants, the thought that in this part of the world, they can become yeoman farmers. They can own their own land. And there's, a lot of land, of course, in North America, of course. So they're going to be moving westward in pursuit for more and more farmlands. And this is going to be, of course, something that is going to, of course, bring about the American Revolution, as we'll see, because there's going to be a push westward. There's a dramatic increase and influx, again, of people moving into the western frontier in pursuit of more farmlands, because there's population growth. There's no more land for farming. There's no more land to create more farms, and those have to be created, of course, in the western frontier. So again, so just keep that in mind, because again, what we see is so far, again, that the colonies were created as companies. Okay, they had a legal charter to exist and operate. They were owned by a society or company of merchants who were given, of course, land grants to develop the land and create enterprises. And they were given a certain degree of autonomy to rule over their own towns and cities in the colonies, create colonial legislation, that is to say. So this is extremely important, because that is going to give rise, of course, to the rise of the merchant class, and wealthy merchants, wealthy planters in the upper and lower colonies that were involved in the import and export of products in a kind of free trade system, free trade system. And they were, again, the ones that are going to dominate, again, the colonies, the societies of the colonies. And of course, the rise of independent farmers, of course, this new social group that is on the rise and that is trying to pursue, of course, more and more land by moving westward, of course. So, again, the navigation laws of the 1760s passed by the British Parliament are going to change. It's going to try to change or alter the way that those colonies operated. Those are a series of laws that were to now regulate trade, monitor trade, and tax it. In other words, the trade, called navigation law, because all trade takes place, again, in navigation systems, again, in traffic, ocean-going trade. Those were actually labeled as the navigation laws. They were also labeled as the American Revenue Acts, because British Parliament is trying to raise revenues. Of course, they're experiencing some, financial difficulties back in London, the British Parliament, and they're trying to, of course, extract more and more taxes from the colonies, extract more revenues, that is to say. So what they're going to do, the navigation laws or the navigation acts, is restrict trade for the colonial merchants, to end, again, this system of free trade by now Great Britain exerting a trade monopoly, again, on those 13 colonies in terms of all the import and exports that have to be now flowing directly from the colonies to the mother country. So everything that needs to be imported into the colonies has to be imported by a British company. And everything that has to be exported out of the colonies has to be directly sent to the mother country and nowhere else. You cannot trade with anybody else but the mother country. Whether you're importing or exporting is, again, exclusive rights with the mother country. And of course, the trading company that was given pretty much the monopoly of this trade was the British East India Company. It was given that monopoly, that if you're going to import sugar, if you're going to import molasses or spices, etc., you have to buy it from the British East India Company. And you cannot buy it from Dutch or French. In other words, monopoly of trade. And also, some of those navigation laws also closed the frontier. They prohibited the colonists from moving to the Western territories. It really closed the frontier for landless colonists, those people that were eager to develop their own farms. They were looking for land to develop farmlands, in other words. Well, some of those navigation laws actually close the frontiers. There's no more migrations, in other words. Okay, nobody can move westward anymore. That is to say, closing the frontier. And so what that, of course, that came with the British Proclamation Act of 1763. This is the piece of legislation that British Parliament passed to close the frontier. It halted westward migrations. It prohibited colonies from actually seizing any more lands to the west. So what the British Proclamation Act says, the colonies cannot grow any longer territorially. So you have to confine yourself to live in those colonies, even though there is, of course, already lack of land, lack of economic opportunities, lack of resources because the population had grown so much. But again, now the British colonies just want to move westward because the opportunities are in the western lands. But the British Proclamation Act had just closed those doors. So that created a lot of anxiety, again, a lot of economic anxiety for those landless colonists that are going to, as we'll see, make an alliance with the merchants and the planters. And we're going to see those groups coming together, of course, to declare independence, of course. So it is at this point that the colonists, of course, are betting on trying to negotiate. You know, they're not declaring independence, not yet, not all of a sudden, but rather what they want is representation, political representation. They want British Parliament to create more and more seats for delegates coming from the 13 colonies. I'm sorry. So again, the issue of representation. They want that, well, if we are going to pay those taxes, if there's now new laws that we have to obey, so we want to have a say again in that. Okay, we want representation. We want to be consulted. We want to take a vote. Okay, we want to negotiate. In other words, to take us into account. So the colonists demand political representation, and after sending so many letters to the British Parliament finally responds in 1766 with the Declaratory Act. Okay, the Declaratory Act said that British Parliament was not going to create new seats in Parliament for colonial delegations. In other words, there's no need for you to send delegates to London to represent the colonies in North America. We can do that for you. You know, it's called virtual representation. We, in good spirits, are going to represent you from afar. You don't need to send any representatives. This is called virtual representation. Okay, British Parliament is the authority of the colonies, and we're going to actually create the laws for the colonies, and we are hereby representing you. We do understand you, and we're going to represent your interests from afar. Even though there's no delegates, no representatives from the colonies here, again, doesn't matter. This is, again, we're in good faith providing that representation to you. And of course, that led, of course, to the lack of representation, the denial of that representation led to revolts. Of course, initial revolts against British rule came about with the coordinated acts or actions or efforts between two different groups that are going to come together, the alliance again of merchants and farmers. Once again, those two groups are going to make an alliance to actually, revolt against British rule, harassing, of course, British tax collectors, British officials are going to be also harassed, and a boycott, of course, of the British companies, the British East India Company, of course, to boycott, British tea and sugar. A boycott means that the colonies are not buying, okay, from British sources. They're not buying the tea and the sugar from the British, from this company, and instead they promote smuggling. What they wanted to do is instead to smuggle the tea, to smuggle the sugar from French, from Dutch companies, and this is how, again, they're trying to revolt against the British, of course. And the most legendary act of resistance or revolt came with the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when, of course, there's in Boston, there's going to be tea merchants, that prevented the British India Company from actually bringing the cargo of tea into the harbor. There were 3 ships, by the way, that were there, British East India Company ships full of tea, and they dumped all that tea into the harbor again. They pretty much dumped like 90,000 chests of tea. So again, this was an act of rebellion, if you will, conducted particularly by the tea merchants. The tea merchants had done that, again, because they were to be driven out of business by the Tea Act of 1773. The Tea Act of 1773 just gave East India Company a total monopoly of the tea trade, and they were going to drive out the tea merchants from that business altogether. And of course, British Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, 1773, 1775, otherwise known as the Intolerable Acts, because what the Coercive Acts did was to respond to the Boston Tea Party and try to punish Massachusetts Bay Company, the wealthy merchants that lived there. Many of them were actually tea merchants, and others were lawyers, shopkeepers, etc. Again, they were part of the merchant class, if you will, that dominated Massachusetts colony. Well, what the Coercive Acts did is that it revoked the charter. Okay, that this is no longer a private company. Okay, Massachusetts Bay Company is no longer a company. In other words, that is privately owned and run and operated. Now is going to be a royal company owned by the king. Okay, a royal charter. It was given now, again, those rights, those land grants were revoked. All of the land, again, that people own in Massachusetts, that people own farms, people own cattle ranches, etc., large estates, large tracts of land, etc. Again, all of that is now the private possession of the king, okay, under the Coercive Acts. And of course, it abolished the colonial assemblies, that the colony is no longer going to be governed by their own colonists. The king is now going to appoint all of the administrators from the local towns, in every official in the local town, all the way to the governor. Of course, they're going to be personal appointees, if you will, of the king. So it pretty much ended that system of autonomy or self-rule, that is to say. And of course, that, unleashed brought about in 1776 the Declaration of Independence. The American Declaration of Independence is very, very important for understanding the Texas Revolution, because there will also be a Declaration of Independence for Texas that will be very similar to the American Declaration of Independence. Okay, because remember that most of the rebels of the Texas Revolution, again, a great many of them are Americans. So what that means is that they're bringing with them certain political ideas that they received from this experience from the American Revolution. The American Revolution shaped the political culture of the United States, of Americans living at this time, and as they're moving into the frontier, as they're moving into places like Texas, they're going to be, moving along with them, of course, the political ideas that serve to actually create the United States and declare independence from Great Britain, of course. And so those ideas that I'm actually referring to is the idea that you got, for example, a system that denies representation, it denies people's rights. What, again, American political culture is based on is the idea, again, that there's certain natural rights, the rights of life, liberty, and property. And whenever we have, again, a system, if you will, that kind of constricts those rights, in American political culture, the conclusion is that this is then the justification for revolution and independence again. So that is really the rationale of the American independence, the Declaration of Independence in this case. So what exactly is there in the Declaration of Independence that we're going to see in the Texas Declaration of Independence? Well, imposing taxation without consent, taxation without representation. That is to say, that's very important. When you have taxes, you have to pay those taxes, but then you have no representation. Well, that, again, in the American Declaration of Independence is clearly stated. This is one of, again, the conditions for, or justifications for revolution, that is to say, revoking the charters again, for example, revoking the charter of Massachusetts Bay. It actually ended a private company, and all the land rights, all the land grants and so on, and all the land that people own within had been revoked. Okay. And they're not honored anymore. So if you receive a certain contract, a land grant, in other words, by the political institutions, the ruling institutions, and tells you, look, this is yours. This is a contract. I'm going to give you this land grant for you to develop the land, to develop enterprises. And then suddenly down the road, it's simply revoked and not honored. It is a violation of property rights. Okay. And this is how, again, Americans are going to see, the issue with Massachusetts Bay, something that will be seen, of course, in the Texas revolutionary experience. Of course, there will be a series of land grants issued to specific empresarios, as they were called, entrepreneurs, land developers. They had developed real estate companies and had lands, of course, they had land grants, and they were revoked. And that, of course, unleashed, of course, the Texas Revolution, of course, and the Declaration of Independence. Also, of course, abolishing self-rule. That with the abolition of the colonial assemblies in Massachusetts and colonial governments, of course, you're also, again, violating the right of people to choose their representatives, to consent. In other words, the consent of the government that people must elect, must have a say again in who they're going to choose as their leader, as their ruler, as a representative, and what kind of laws, of course, will be passed. They must consent. They must take a vote. That is to say, well, that is being, of course, abolished as well. Those are central issues, of course, that we're going to see in the Declaration of Independence, of course. So the struggle for independence was a struggle that brought together certain social groups, certain sectors of colonial society, like the merchants, planters, farmers, that were fighting particularly, again, for property rights. Again, this is what's at stake. Planters, of course, even in the South, realized that their plantations could be revoked at any given time. That what happened in Massachusetts can happen in all the other colonies, of course. Revoking those charters, that the colonies can simply now become the private possessions, again, of the king or any other individual, and they can simply seize your land, seize your commercial enterprise, and violate your right to property. That is to say, they were also fighting to gain independence, to continue free trade. They wanted to elect who they wanted to trade with, of course, not be restricted. Land settlement, as far as farmers are concerned, of course, what they want is settle in the West. They want, to migrate, to move into those lands in the West, to create farms, and the ability, of course, to create their own communities, to govern their own affairs, what is called self-rule. Again, this is also, another idea that is going to be, central to the struggle of the independence revolution of the United States, of course. Something that, once again, we're going to see in the Texas revolutionary experience. Okay, so at any rate, now we see in 1787, after independence was gained in 1783, we're going to see that by 1787, we're going to see the creation, of course, of the United States. There's going to be, of course, a new nation created, the United States as an independent nation, and it was created as a republic, okay? As a republic. Again, this is what back during those times came to be known as the ideas of classical republicanism that were so dominant among the merchant and planter class. And the merchants and the planters were really people that wanted to create a republican form of government in this new nation. They wanted to create a republic, that is to say, the American Republic, and they finally did in 1787, of course, because they were highly influenced by the ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. So again, the creation of the United States as an independent nation was largely influenced by the ideas of Plato that were actually written in this very, very epic, legendary treatise he wrote called The Republic, Plato's Republic. Again, this is, giving us all of the ideas of what is called classical republicanism of ancient Greece that were so inspiring, to the planters and the merchants. So what is then a republic? What is the idea? Is this idea of classical republicanism. What is a republic? Well, for Plato, that is the ideal state, the republic. And what is the ideal state? What is the ideal form of government that he calls the republic? Well, according to Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher, the ideal state is the state that is actually ruled by philosophers. Again, philosophers that are actually driven by virtue and the desire, to rule for the general welfare as well. Okay, so they're not really governing to enrich themselves or to, advance their own private interests, but rather they're inspired by virtue and wisdom. That they have wisdom, they have the wisdom to bring about the best laws, the most virtuous legislation that will benefit all of society, that will actually generate, the state of happiness, state of justice for all people, for the general welfare, that is to say. That's what a philosopher is. And this is the ideal society. So this is going to be very important because even Texas, after independence, is going to be created as a republic, by the way, just like the United States. It followed the same principles, that the founders of the Texas Republic also were imitating the ideas of the American Revolution and, of course, the creation of the United States as a republic itself, based on the ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, that the ideal state is one in which the philosophers are the ones that are going to be making the decisions. They're the leaders or the rulers, of the population, because they have wisdom, they have virtue, and they're ruling to benefit, again, the general population, selflessly, that is to say. So what they entailed, of course, is that a republic, therefore, is based on the notion, according to the founding fathers of the United States, on the notion that a republic must have a representative form of government. Again, this is a government ruled by representatives. So people don't rule directly. They are going to be represented at the local, state, and national level again. So every locality is going to actually have representatives governing the affairs of the locality, of the local town. The state as well. Okay, we're going to elect representatives. All the cities, all the towns of the state are going to elect the state representatives, the governor, etc., and everything else. And likewise, the nation will be governed by representatives that come from every state, okay, to be in Washington, D.C., etc., be writing legislation, and so on and so forth. Again, it's a representative form of government, but representatives, the people that are going to lead society, since they have to be wise. In other words, this is a republic. A republic is ruled by philosophers. So therefore, the people that will be representing the society will have to be the most educated, okay? Because you need to be as much, you have to be as wise as possible, as educated as possible, as virtuous as possible. So therefore, during this time, the belief was that those that own property meet that criteria, because if you own property, more than likely you're educated. That was the assumption. If you own property, more than likely you have received some form of education. You know how to read, you know how to write, you're versed perhaps in law, you're versed in economics, you're versed in politics, you're versed in culture, and so on, in one degree or another. So you have the capacity, again, to make rational choices. In other words, to be guided by your the highest intellectual faculties. In other words, and so you're qualified to rule. You're qualified to lead. So again, a republic is one in which the representatives will have to own property. There's property qualifications for holding office, but there's also property qualifications for voting, because the property owners are believed to be the wisest, again, of all the people during this time. Again, so this is, again, the ideal state according to classical republicanism. Classical republicanism is the ideas of Plato, of classical Greece, ancient Greece, that Plato, of course, was talking about, a society ruled by philosophers, of course. So again, this is what the American Republic, of course, is bringing about, the idea of federalism, sharing, of course, power with the local and the state governments. That it's not just going to be the national government, again, that is going to be totally, legislating for the entire country, but rather is going to distribute some of those responsibilities to the local and the states, that the local towns, the cities, and the states are also going to have, of course, rights, the rights to legislate, to create laws, in other words. It's called federalism, a Bill of Rights, the rights of citizens, of course. There's going to be in 1791, of course, the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. And here we see, of course, the issue of private property and contracts, again, that in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution, we're going to see the significance, again, of what is called the ideas of life, liberty, and property, but particularly property, and the ideas of contracts as well, that those are sacred, that those must be honored. That is to say, the ideas of property and contracts, and of course the separation of church and state are going to also be central as well. Okay, so at any rate, so again, this is very important, because this is going to serve as an inspiration for the Texas Revolution. How the American Revolution unfolded is going to inspire, of course, the people in Texas that declare independence, that are going to come together and of course declare independence from Mexico in this case. Now, the French Revolution, I'm not going to spend more than a few minutes here, but it's also going to be very influential in this age of revolutions that were sweeping across Western Europe and the Americas, of course, bringing about new political structures, political change. It happened in 1789. Also, again, in a very similar way that it happened in England and it happened in North America, again, the rise of the middle class. Once again, there's the rise of merchants in France, for example, commercial landowners, investors, shopkeepers. We're going to see the rise of this very, very important group that had absolutely no political representation in France. They were treated as commoners, just as general population that, of course, needed to pay tribute. They needed to pay tribute, of course, to the institutions that were in charge of collecting the tribute, and that they were the ones that, of course, enjoy a privileged status in France, because France was still living under this feudal order, again, in which there were privileged institutions like the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church. Of course, privilege. And that privilege, of course, was something that was seen in terms of the legal immunities, again, that the monarchy, aristocracy, and church enjoyed, that they were immune to civil law. So whenever, again, the aristocracy or members of the church committed a crime, they were not to be tried, they were not to be judged by a civil jury under civil law. They had their own private courts, that is to say. Privilege was also seen as, the ones, again, institutions collecting taxes and tribute from the population. And of course, the merchants, the middle class was heavily taxed, more so than the peasants. But nonetheless, what actually is going to exacerbate the social order in France, leading to the French Revolution, was the issue, of course, of feudal dues and feudal debt. That is to say, feudal dues is the taxes or the tribute that the population needed to pay. There's a certain due at the end of the year, okay? Peasants, farmers, artisans, shopkeepers, merchants, they all have to pay those dues. And whenever they fail to pay those dues, they accumulate year by year, and they start to create what is called a feudal debt. That is to say, so if farmers or peasants were unable to pay those dues, they simply became indebted in terms of the next year. They had to catch up and pay those dues the following year. And if they fail to do so, they will simply be accumulating year after year after year after year, of course. Whether you had to pay dues to the church or the aristocracy or the monarchy. And of course, this leads, of course, to the, those groups in France, like the peasants, the merchants, the artisans, and other groups, to demand political representation. Well, we are paying all those taxes, okay? And our taxes accumulate whenever they're not paid, they become debt. Well, let's change the political system, in other words, political representation. This is going to lead to a revolt, of course, in 1789, when the king refused to provide representation to the masses, to the French masses. The French masses simply revolted in Paris, in the city of Paris. They stormed actually a fort called the Bastille. There were many prisoners there that were actually imprisoned for not paying those feudal dues. That is to say, people that failed to pay those debts, that refused to pay those debts, that revolted or voiced opposition, they were simply sent to the Bastille. And so what's going to happen in 1789 on July is that, again, the masses are going to go to this prison and release all the people there, most of whom were sent there precisely because they failed to actually pay those taxes, that tribute, by the way. Okay, so again, because this revolt was massive and so widespread in Paris, the king was forced to compromise and allow the masses to create their own assembly. Okay, you want representation. All right. So, okay, to create a political body in which you're going to actually be in charge of this and we can actually negotiate, the monarchy can negotiate with you, etc. Like a parliament, in other words, like the British Parliament, in a very similar way. So in 1789, there's now a new National Assembly, like Congress, like a national Congress created in France. And there's going to be people arriving from all over France, from many different parts of France. And they're going to divide themselves between the people that sat in the left wing of that stadium. It was actually like a large theater, like a large stadium. And the people that sat in the left wing were known as the liberals. And of course, the people that sat in the right wing, that were the representatives, again, of the monarchy, that were the representatives of the church, the representatives of the aristocracy, became known as the conservatives. In other words, the right wing, conservatives, left wing, liberals. The people that sat on the left wing, the so-called liberals, were the representatives of the merchants. They were the representatives of the peasants, of the farmers, the artisans. In other words, the masses. In other words, that had no privileges. In other words, so this is going to lead to those political terms, political ideology that we're so familiar today. Liberalism, conservatism, left wing, right wing. Again, the French Revolution created that again in the National Assembly of 1789. What the liberals wanted to create a new state, a new constitution for France based on the ideas of liberty and equality, that all people will be free of debt, free of tribute, that nobody will be imprisoned because they had, pending dues of tribute to pay to the church, etc., and that there will be no privileges, that they all should be treated equal before the law, that nobody should be treated, differently because they're a member of the nobility or because they're part of the monarchy, etc., to be tried in different courts. They're all equal, that is to say. And the right wing, of course, wanted a state in which it will create, of course, order, okay, and in the new nation of France, because there were widespread revolts in Paris, of course. And the people, of course, the monarchy, aristocracy, and the church, of course, were very concerned that this new state that the liberals wanted to bring about was going to disrupt the old feudal order, that is to say. And so they wanted pretty much to maintain that old order, that is to say. Okay. So nonetheless, after several, of course, arguments, debates, and turmoils that were raging across Paris and across France, finally the French Republic is born. Finally they come about and pretty much create a new state. The first French Republic is created, another republic once again. And this republic in 1792 was a constitutional monarchy. And so what that entailed is that the monarchy is not the absolute ruler anymore. A constitutional monarchy means that there's now a Congress, a National Assembly, that is now the authority of France, that is going to be writing laws for France. And the monarchy is going to be there as a kind of executive branch, that there's going to be shared power between the monarchy and, of course, the National Assembly. Again, they introduced a new constitution called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, abolishing feudalism, abolishing tribute altogether, introducing the idea of equality before the law, abolishing privileges, of course, in France, and separating church and state. Eventually, again, the revolutionaries, the people that actually created the French Republic, are going to actually imprison Louis XVI, the king, the monarch, in 1793, as he's attempting to bring a foreign army, into France and end the revolution. Louis XVI was a firm believer of divine rights of kings. He thought his right to rule was absolute, given to him by God. And that was really going on during this time, the creation of this new constitution, this republic, was childish. That this is not happening. In other words, that I need to actually seek the help of my cousins and my family members in different parts of Europe and actually end the revolt. In other words, in 1793, and of course he was be executed. Another king that, of course, is going to be executed in these waves of revolutions, because this is a king that refused, of course, to go with the change and allow people, of course, to create a representative form of government, of course. So in sum, what we see in the age of revolutions, of course, is the rise of capitalism. Okay, the rise of capitalism, of course, the merchant class, private property, for example. This is very essential for the creation, of course, of new ideas, the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment, like political representation, natural rights, self-rule, that they were pushed by, the merchants, of course, the merchant class, the democratic revolutions that swept across the Western world in the 17th to the 19th centuries, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the French Revolutions. This is, again, instrumental for understanding the Texas Revolution, because those revolutions were anti-monarchical struggles against kings that refused, again, to bring about political reform. King Charles I, King George III, King Louis XVI. Of course, they were all challenged during those upheavals because they saw themselves as absolute rulers, divine rights of kings. Those revolutions brought new political systems of representation. Parliament, for example, Congress, creation of assemblies, for example, the creation of new nation states as well, like the American and French republics, for example. Okay, very, very important that we're going to see the new political systems of representation that provide representation to, the merchants particularly, and they're actually involved in the creation of new political entities, new states, like the American and French republics, that are going to, of course, institute constitutions that, of course, clearly stated the kind of liberties and guarantees that the citizens enjoy, like life, liberty, and property, along with the separation of church and state. Again, so that, of course, is very, very important for understanding, of course, the future of this course as a whole, because now we're moving into a whole new era. Again, so I really wanted to pretty much outline the age of revolutions, put the Texas Revolution in this larger context, so you'll understand that this was simply a series of changes, a series of revolutions that have been occurring in the Western world, in which, of course, there was, new social groups like the merchants that were formulating the ideas of the future, of how human societies can be organized politically. What will be the ideal state? Okay, representation. It's a representative form of government. Okay, so we're going to see, of course, those changes taking place from each of those revolutions we discussed. And of course, we're going to see also the constitutions, of course, new constitutions written that actually clearly state the rights that the citizens enjoy, and so on and so forth. And what they're doing, again, those revolutions, is pretty much ending the old feudal order, ending the old political institutions of the past, whether they're monarchical institutions, aristocratic, based on nobility, again, status and privilege, and of course the idea of the church, being, of course, so involved in matters of the state as well, separating church and state. Now, of course, now we turn our attention to the Texas Revolution to look at the causes and the origins. It's going to be easier now to understand the causes of the Texas Revolution, because now we have a context. Now, it will be easier to understand, again, that when we talk about, for example, the causes and the origins of the Texas Revolution, we have to talk about Mexico, because this revolution will be an independent struggle by the Tejanos, again, the settlers of Texas, whether we're talking about Mexican Texans or the American settlers there in Texas that came in the 1820s, in early 1830s, how they're going to come together and declare independence from Mexico. So what this now brings us to is trying to understand, of course, Mexico's feudal institutions. Still very strong feudal institutions in Mexico, most of which are headquartered in Mexico City, in the Central Valley of Mexico. Again, the church, the Catholic Church, is so central to the Mexican state that gained independence from Spain in 1821, but nonetheless, despite the fact that now we have an independent Mexico in 1821, the Catholic Church still the official church of Mexico, the official religion of Mexico. Catholicism is the official religion of the state, and the church is very much involved in matters of politics. It collects tribute, for example. It owns large tracts of land as well. It's in charge of education as well, and also the priests can actually meddle in political affairs. They can actually preach in the sermons, political sermons, that is to say, during Mass. So it's a feudal institution. Again, the merge of church and state are still going on in Mexico, of course. Texas is part of, again, Mexico. Feudal landowners. Again, there's, of course, the large hacendados that collect tribute as well, in terms of products, in terms of labor, particularly from indigenous populations. But again, there's feudalism. There is an aristocracy. Again, there are people that go back to Spanish families. They're connected to Spanish families. They're in Mexico. But again, they own a lot of land. And they're the ones dominated politics, of course. And they're centered around Mexico City as well. And then, of course, there's the remnants of this monarchical leadership. There's monarchists. There's people that really favor in Mexico strong institutions. They want in Mexico a monarchy, okay, or they want an individual to be the absolute ruler, again, of Mexico. They're still, again, very dominant. Now, when we look, of course, at Texas itself, we see that there's a sharp contrast between the feudal institutions of Mexico City that are still dominating Mexican politics, and the sharp contrast with, of course, Texas' autonomous origins, that Texas had been pretty much on its own ever since the creation of this province by Spain in the 1600s. For most of the colonial period, Texas was pretty much ruled by its own people, okay, without being directly ruled and controlled by Mexico City. It had enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy for most of the colonial period, something that Texans are going to be very, very jealous about, that they want to remain autonomous. They want to be, of course, in control of their own towns, etc. So this autonomous origins, of course, was due to several factors, of course. One is the geographical location of Texas in relationship to Mexico City. That was a great advantage, that it was so far removed. It was so far in the northern frontier, so far removed from the capital city, Mexico City, that it was just so far to actually be governing directly, to be overseeing and actually monitoring and pretty much shaping the destinies of the Texas residents from so far away. So this geographical isolation, was a great benefit to the development of this autonomy, this idea of self-governance, self-rule. And the fact that, there were lack of transportation systems, there was no roads to speak of that actually connected Texas to Mexico City. Of course, there's no railroad, not until, much, much later after the Texas Revolution, we're going to see the development of some railroads. We're going to get there eventually. The railroad revolution of the United States. So there's no transportation technology. So this was a great advantage that, Texas was pretty much on its own in the northern fringes of Mexico, of course, and that led, of course, to the creation of autonomous towns and city councils. We're also going to see that the local merchants, the cattle ranchers, are going to be the ones dominant in those little towns of Texas, like Laredo, San Antonio, Goliad, Nacogdoches, for example, and they're going to create their own city councils and govern their own local affairs. That is to say, without so much interference from Mexico City. Okay, so again, this is leading to this tradition, this autonomous origins, if you will. Okay, and when Mexico became independent from Spain, what we see is that with the creation of the Mexican Republic in 1824, the creation of the Mexican Republic brought about, of course, a new constitution, the Federalist Constitution of 1824, that created the new state of Mexico, the Republican state of Mexico, the Mexican Republic, that provided that constitution, this Federalist Constitution, a guarantee for Texas to kind of continue with this autonomous tradition. Because what the Federalist Constitution did was to actually distribute powers to the state and the local towns across Mexico. That Mexico City was not going to be ruling absolute all the states and the local towns, but it was going to grant autonomy to the towns and the states so they can also craft their own laws. Very similar to the Constitution of the United States, by the way. It was kind of identical, the kind of federal system, local and state rights, that is to say. So this is kind of providing yet a continuity for this autonomous origins that this Constitution is going to allow Texans to rule themselves in a certain sense, because that's what the Constitution of Mexico of 1824 had stated, by the way. So now the third reason, why there's going to be the revolution in Texas is due to the fact that we're going to see the rise of capitalism, of course, the rise of capitalism in Texas. Likewise, this is something we have seen, again, all across, this topic since the very beginning. The rise of the merchant class, for example. There's going to be the rise of merchants in Texas, bringing along the idea of private property, individual wealth, individual property, and of course, commercial enterprise as well. So this is one of the prerequisites for the creation of a revolution that is still, that a society, again, in which a society is trying to free itself from feudal institutions. Okay, so when a society is still governed by feudal institutions, whether monarchical or aristocratic or a church, a combination of those, and now you see the rise of capitalism, obviously there's going to be a clash between those old feudal institutions and this new capitalist order, in which there's now a new social group, the merchant class, that is trying to bring about reforms, political reforms, to create a new state that can protect, of course, private property and commercial enterprise, that is to say. So again, this is kind of like the prerequisite, again, for emerging revolutions, if you will, the rise of a merchant class, private property, and commercial enterprise. Of course, in Texas, we see that with the rise of rancher entrepreneurs. Again, so when we talk about the merchant class in Texas, we have to understand that we're talking about ranchers, okay, first and foremost. The ranchers are going to be this type of specific class, again, that is going to be dominant in the commercial activities of Texas very early on and creating the first enterprises, so to speak, which is, again, a ranch, a cattle ranch. Okay. They emerge in the late colonial and early Mexican period. Again, the rancher entrepreneurs when they create, of course, ranches that they own, that they administer, and that they consider those as their own personal property and their individual wealth. That is to say, there's, of course, the rise of very wealthy ranchero families in Texas. Again, something we have seen in the other revolutions, like whether the English Civil War, for example, or the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, we see the rise of wealthy merchants and wealthy planters. That is to say, that are going to be affected by British laws. Likewise, we're going to see the rise of very wealthy ranchero families that will be affected by Mexican laws, as we'll see. Okay. And also we're going to see more small scale type of ranchers, medium-sized ranches owned by families. They will be scattered across Texas, about 350 what's called rancherias, little ranches. In other words, they're family-owned, family-operated, and they're also going to be a kind of family enterprise. That is also going to be part of this growing merchant class in Texas. If you consider that along with the autonomy that Texas has enjoyed, this, the situation of self-rule, self-governance, this is going to be a perfect combination. Again, that is going to create the conditions for a revolution whenever Mexico was trying to change, again, the political and economic order of Texas. Of course, there's the emergence of cattle markets. Cattle ranchers in Texas had markets, access to markets in Mexico and some other provinces like Nuevo León and Coahuila. There will be cattle trails from San Antonio, for example, people driving cattle to, places like Nuevo León and Coahuila to sell them in large cattle markets, but also in French Louisiana back in the colonial period when Louisiana was still part of France. We're going to see that there's also going to be, of course, trade taking place with New Orleans, of course, Louisiana as well. Again, this is very important because the rancheros are going to be instrumental in the coming revolution we're going to see, particularly, of course, when the rancheros begin to build more and more commercial ties to the United States during the independence movement from Spain. During the independence of Mexico from Spain that started in 1810 and spanned all the way to 1821, many of the rebel leaders of Texas were actually ranchers that were fighting the royal forces of Spain. And when the royal forces of Spain reached Texas and they start to destroy a lot of properties, again, of those rebel leaders and ranches, many of them actually flee to Texas. They flee Texas into the United States. They go to Louisiana. And while they're going to be there, of course, they're going to actually spend a number of years living in Louisiana, and they're going to be very fascinated about the accomplishments of this society in New Orleans that was geared towards international trade and exports, etc., and the prosperity, again, of the port of Louisiana. One of those rancheros, again, that are going to flee into Louisiana and spend a number of years there was the ranchero from one of the wealthiest families of Texas, the Navarro family. Again, Jose Antonio Navarro from San Antonio will be one of those rebels that will be forced to flee Texas, go into New Orleans, and from there, he's going to continue his trading operations by smuggling horses and mules, in and out of Texas from New Orleans, by the way. So there's still trade taking place, and there's a smuggling of horses and mules, of course. And he builds very strong links, very strong connections with American merchants, okay, in New Orleans. That is to say, by 1803, once again, by 1803, New Orleans is now part of the United States. Okay, the Louisiana Purchase, again, this land was purchased from France, all of Louisiana and all huge tracts of land called the New Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory becomes now part of U.S. territory. So now we have American merchants in Louisiana, and the Navarro family, of course, Jose Antonio Navarro, is building very strong connections with American merchants, so much so that when he returns back to Texas in 1821, after independence was finally gained, he's going to come with a lot of experience in terms of the international trade that he witnessed in New Orleans, the production of sugar in New Orleans, the production of cotton, and how that actually the export of sugar and cotton to the world was bringing a lot of revenues to New Orleans. So he really witnessed how, a society can be changed. A society, an economy can be transformed in a way to bring prosperity. So he's pretty much, dreaming or imagining that the same can happen in Texas, that maybe what Texas needs is to become just like Louisiana, in other words, based on an export economy and so on and so forth. And when he comes back, he becomes mayor of San Antonio in 1821. And of course, what happens after 1821 is that now Texas will be now linked to the United States in terms of trade, because now there will be a more legal type of trade taking place between Texas and New Orleans, Louisiana, now part of the United States. And of course, Texas is going to now link with the U.S. economy. Okay. The Navarros, of course, are going to be very instrumental in trying to foster, of course, not only trade, but also immigration, to bring Americans into Texas in order to bring development, to bring investment, to bring capital, and to transform this province, of course. So the Navarros, of course, are going to be very instrumental once again in bringing about the kind of changes that is going to start transforming Texas slowly but surely into a more capitalist region. That is to say, to foster capitalism, again, by inviting the Americans to colonize, to settle, develop enterprises, and the like. Something that we're going to actually cover in session 3. We're going to continue looking at the origins of the Texas Revolution by looking particularly at the rise of capitalism in Texas, the rise of enterprises we're going to see with American colonization. We're going to see, of course, the development of real estate, for example, real estate companies, land development, cotton plantations, a cotton economy, and the like, and how changes in Mexico City, how Mexico City is going to change course and bring about certain reforms to kind of hinder more migrations, more colonization to take place, etc., and to end the Constitution of 1824, how there will be a change, the political system in Mexico in 1835, 1836. Mexico is going to now bring about a centralist republic, is going to centralize authority in Mexico City. This is going to set off, of course, the conditions for revolution in Texas, leading to the uprising in San Antonio, in El Alamo, etc., the invasion, of course, of Texas by the dictator Santa Anna, the Declaration of Independence by Texas, and, of course, the struggle. All of that will be seen, will be assessed in session 3. This is the end of session 2, and then we'll see then in session 3 for the next session. Thank you.